The woman sat in a straight-backed chair by a cold fireplace and listened to her father-in-law speak about her son, as if the boy were a piece of furniture. Aldrich Ashford stood in the parlor of the farmhouse, with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man delivering a verdict he had already decided was just. He was 61 years old. He had built this farm from what he liked to call nothing, though the nothing had included a substantial inheritance and the labor of men paid less than the cost of their keep. He had opinions about everything and doubts about nothing, and his opinions carried the weight of law on the 400 acres he controlled. "The land needs an heir," he said. "The boy stays." 5 days. That was what he gave her. He gave her a horse, which was generous by his accounting. He gave her the 7 sheep that had been part of her dowry, a gesture toward the appearance of fairness rather than fairness itself. What he did not give her was her son. Cale Ashford, 4 years old, with his mother's dark hair and his father's silence, belonged to the land. That was the word Aldrich used. Belonged. As if 4 years of nursing and feeding and singing through fevers and walking through nightmares had made no claim that a deed of ownership could not erase. Alara sat in the chair and felt the word settle over her like a stone placed on a grave. Belonged. She had heard Aldrich use that word about his cattle. She had heard him use it about the timber along the North Ridge. She had heard him use it about the creek that ran through the eastern pasture, as if water could be owned, as if anything that moved and breathed and grew could be pinned to a piece of paper and held there forever. Now he used it about her son, and the word sounded exactly the same as it always had. Flat. Final. A door closing in a house where she had never been given a key. Dorothea Ashford stood behind her husband. She was 57, her face arranged in an expression of Christian sorrow that fooled no one who had spent 5 years watching her. She had never wanted Ilara in this house, the daughter of a carpenter marrying into the Ashford name. 5 years of small cruelties had made that clear enough. The portions served last at dinner, the rooms cleaned last by the help. The way Dorothea said Ilara's name, always with a slight pause before it, as if she had to remember that such a person existed. The way she held Cale on her lap during family prayers, positioning the boy between herself and Ilara, as if proximity were the same as possession. Now Dorothea allowed herself a small smile, the kind that surfaces when you have won something you wanted for a very long time and can finally stop pretending you were not fighting for it. Cedric sat by the window, looking at something outside that required his complete attention. He was 29 years old, heir to 400 acres, husband to the woman being cast out, father to the boy being claimed. And he said nothing. He had always said nothing. That was the thing Ilara had learned across 5 years of marriage. Some men are weak through cruelty. Some men are weak through silence. Cedric was the second kind, and the second kind was worse because you could not even hate them properly. You could only watch them fail you and know they would fail you again. You could only sit across from them at breakfast and see the guilt flickering behind their eyes and know that the guilt would never grow large enough to become action. Cedric Ashford felt things. That was the tragedy of him. He felt everything and did nothing, and the distance between feeling and doing was where his wife and son fell through the floor. 5 days, Aldrich said. I trust that will be sufficient to make arrangements." Ilara looked at her husband. Cedric continued to study the window. She looked at her mother-in-law. Dorothea's smile widened by a fraction, and Ilara said nothing. Because what was there to say that would change anything? What was there to argue that would move Aldrich Ashford from a position he had already taken? She had learned that, too, in 5 years. Arguing with people who own things is like arguing with weather. The weather does not hear you. The weather simply continues. She rose from the chair and walked out of the parlor without asking permission to leave. She did not look back. She did not pause at the doorway for one final glance at the room where her marriage had just been declared over. She simply walked, one foot in front of the other, through the hall and toward the stairs. And if her hands were trembling, she pressed them flat against her skirt, and no one saw. She climbed the stairs to her room, the room that had been hers and Cedric's, and was now just a space she would occupy for 5 more days. She closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to feel, for exactly 1 minute, the full weight of what had just happened. The walls pressed close. The ceiling pressed down. The silence of the house wrapped around her like a hand closing slowly into a fist. 1 minute. She gave herself that. Then she opened the wardrobe, reached into the lining of her winter coat, and counted the money she had hidden there over 3 years of secret sewing work. $51. Not much. Not enough for a train ticket and a boarding house, and a new start in a city where no one knew her name. But enough for something. Maybe enough for everything. Because Ilara Whitmore had prepared for this day. Not this specific day, but this kind of day. The day when Dorothea would finally convince Aldrich that the marriage was a mistake. The day when Cedric would sit by a window and say nothing while his family was dismantled around him. She had hoped it would not come. She had prayed in the early years that things would change, that Dorothea would soften, that Cedric would find the courage his father had never given him room to grow. But hope and prayer had given way to preparation, and preparation had given way to a plan. Ilara stood and walked to the window. From here she could see the north fence line, and beyond it the tree line. And beyond that, invisible from this angle, but present in her mind like a room she had already furnished, the ravine. They thought they were giving her 5 days to leave. They did not know she had been leaving for 8 months. One piece of knowledge at a time, one hidden dollar at a time, one visit to a limestone overhang at a time, standing under the rock ceiling while rain fell outside, thinking, this is already a room. It simply has not been finished. That had been 8 months ago, a morning in early spring, when she had gone looking for a stray sheep along the north fence and followed its tracks past the tree line and down a slope she had never explored. The tracks disappeared into brush, but Ilara kept walking, drawn by the sound of water running somewhere below. And then the ground opened in front of her, and she was standing at the edge of a ravine. It was not large, 12 feet wide at the mouth, cutting back into the hillside for several hundred feet, the walls rising on either side in pale gray limestone, streaked with rust and mineral deposits. A creek ran along the bottom, clear and cold, making the kind of sound that water makes when it has been running over the same stones for longer than anyone can remember. But it was the overhang that stopped her. Halfway along the east wall, the rock jutted outward in a broad shelf, extending 20 feet across and 11 feet deep where it met the clay bank at the back. The ceiling was 8 feet high where the overhang began, sloping gently downward as it went deeper. Solid limestone above, dry clay behind, the creek below for water. And the opening faced south, which meant warmth in winter and shade in summer, and the kind of natural protection that a person could not improve upon, no matter how much money or time they had. Alara had stood beneath that overhang, with rain falling beyond its edge, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. Something with edges. She had looked at the space the way her father had taught her to look at spaces. Not for what they were, but for what they could become. A room. This is already a room, she had thought. It simply has not been finished. From that day forward, every walk along the north property had a purpose. Every early morning excursion had a destination. She memorized the paths. She counted the steps from the fence to the tree line to the ravine. She visited the overhang 17 times over 8 months, always with an excuse ready if anyone asked. Looking for a lost sheep, checking the fence line, walking off a headache. No one ever asked. That was the advantage of being invisible in your own home. People who do not see you do not wonder where you go. 5 days was more than she needed, but she would use every hour of it. The dog found her that evening in the barn. Bramble was a 2-year-old hound, the color of autumn leaves, with a notch in his left ear from a trap he had stepped in as a pup. Alara had found him in the woods during the 2nd year of her marriage, his leg bloodied and his eyes wild with pain, and she had carried him back to the barn and nursed him for 3 weeks without telling anyone. She had cleaned the wound with water boiled over a fire she lit behind the stable, where the smoke could not be seen from the house. She had fed him scraps hidden in her apron pockets. She had sat with him in the dark and talked to him, because talking to a wounded dog was easier than talking to a husband who would not answer. By the time Dorothea discovered the dog, he had healed. By the time Aldrich decided the animal was useless for hunting, Bramble had become so devoted to Alara that sending him away would have required more effort than ignoring him. He slept at the foot of Kale's bed every night. He followed Alara through her days like a shadow made of loyalty and copper-colored fur. And he was the only member of the household who seemed to understand that something was wrong. Because he found her in the barn that evening and pressed his body against her legs and did not move until she knelt down and put her arms around his neck. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy. We are going on a trip soon. You and me and Kale. Somewhere no one will find us." Bramble's tail swept once across the barn floor. "That is right," Alara said. "Somewhere they cannot take him from me." The 4 days that followed were ordinary in every visible way. Alara performed her duties. She ate meals with the family, sitting at the end of the table where she had always sat, saying little, eating less. She washed dishes and mended fences and fed chickens and did all the things she had always done, because routine was the best disguise she had. Any change in behavior would draw attention. Any sign of preparation would be noticed. So she changed nothing. She prepared in the spaces between the things no one watched her do. She played with Cale in the afternoons, careful not to seem more attached than usual, careful not to cry when he wrapped his small arms around her neck and asked why grandmother was smiling so much lately. "Grandmother is happy," Alara said. "Some people smile when they are happy." "Are you happy, Mama?" Alara looked at her son, 4 years old, dark hair falling across his forehead, eyes that had not yet learned to distrust the world, a mouth that still asked questions, expecting honest answers. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to pull him into her arms and whisper the plan into his ear and promise him that no one was going to take him anywhere. But 4-year-old children do not keep secrets. 4-year-old children tell their grandmothers everything, especially when their grandmothers know exactly which questions to ask. "I am going to be," she said, "very soon." At night, she prepared, one item at a time, moved from the house to a location she had chosen 8 months earlier. A hollow beneath a fallen oak, 200 yards past the north fence, covered with leaves and invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Sewing kit. The carpenter's ads her father had given her as a wedding gift. The one Aldrich had never noticed, because tools were beneath his attention. Dried food wrapped in cloth. Blankets rolled tight and bound with twine. 2 changes of clothes for Cale, 1 change for herself. A leather journal that had belonged to her father, filled with notes on construction and measurements and the careful observations of a man who had spent his life understanding how things were built. She moved through darkness like someone who had practiced this journey many times, because she had. 8 months of walking the north property in the early morning, learning where roots crossed the path, where mud collected after rain, where moonlight reached and where it did not. She knew which gate hinges were quiet and which ones screamed. She knew where the dogs in the main kennel slept and where their hearing faded. She knew the exact minute when the farmhands changed their watch and left a gap of silence wide enough for a woman and her shadow to pass through. On the 3rd night, she visited the ravine one final time. She stood beneath the limestone overhang in the darkness and listened to the creek running below and felt the dry clay bank behind her and looked up at the rock ceiling 8 feet above her head and said to no one, tomorrow night, we begin." The 4th night came with a cold wind from the north and a sky full of stars that seemed closer than usual, the way stars sometimes seem when the air is thin and the world is about to change. Alara did not sleep. She lay in her bed with her eyes open and listened to the house settle around her and waited for the hour when movement would be safest. Midnight passed. 1 in the morning. 2. She listened to the rhythm of the house, the creak of beams contracting in the cold, the distant sound of Aldrich coughing in his sleep, a thick, wet sound that spoke of age catching up with a man who believed himself invincible. The silence from Cedric's side of the bed, where he lay with his back to her, pretending to sleep, the way he pretended to do most things. At 3, she rose. The hallway was dark. The stairs creaked in the places she had memorized, and she moved past them, stepping on the edges of each tread, making no sound. Her heart beat so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire house. It did not. Cale's room was at the end of the hall, next to the room where Aldrich and Dorothea slept. Ilara opened the door, 1 inch at a time, listening for the hinge she had oiled 2 days earlier with fat from the kitchen. The hinge made no sound. She slipped inside and knelt beside her son's bed and put her hand gently over his mouth before his eyes opened. "Shh," she breathed. "It is Mama. We are going on an adventure. You must be very, very quiet." Cale's eyes found hers in the darkness, wide and startled at first, then settling as he recognized her shape, her smell, the particular warmth of her palm against his face. He nodded once beneath her hand. "Good boy," she said. "Get dressed, quickly and quietly." She had laid out his clothes the night before, hidden beneath his pillow where Dorothea would never think to look. He dressed in the dark, clumsy with sleep, but silent, understanding somehow that this was important, that Mama's voice had a sound in it that meant no questions. Children hear things in their parents' voices that words do not carry. Urgency, fear. The particular quality of determination that comes when a person has decided to do something dangerous and irreversible and has made peace with the consequences. Bramble rose from the foot of the bed and stretched and looked at Ilara with eyes that seemed to say, "Finally." "Come," she whispered. They moved down the back stairs, through the kitchen, where the embers in the stove still glowed a faint orange, out the door that led to the root cellar, which led to the yard, which led to the barn. The cold hit them as they stepped outside. Cale shivered and pressed closer to his mother's leg. Bramble's ears went flat against his head, then forward again, reading the darkness for threats. The sheep were in the north pasture, separated from the main herd 2 days earlier on Ilara's instructions to the farm ant, who had not questioned her because farm ants did not question the family. Even family members who were about to stop being family. 7 sheep, 1 horse, 1 dog. 1 4-year-old boy who held his mother's hand and walked through the darkness without asking where they were going. And Ilara, 25 years old, with $51 sewn into her coat lining and a carpenter's adze strapped to her saddle, and a plan that depended entirely on one simple fact. No one would think to look for her in the place she was going. No one would imagine that a woman they had cast out would go deeper into the land they owned rather than away from it. No one would search the ravine. They would check the roads heading east toward the cities. They would ask at train stations and boarding houses and churches that took in women with nowhere else to go. They would search every direction except down. Dawn found them at the hollow oak, retrieving the supplies she had hidden. By the time the sun was fully up, they were moving through the trees, following the creek north, the sheep trailing behind in a loose group. Bramble ranging ahead and then returning, checking and rechecking the way. Cale rode the horse, too tired to walk, his head nodding against his chest, waking occasionally to look around with the confused wonder of a child who has been lifted from one world and set down in another. Ilara led the animal by its bridle, watching the trees, counting the landmarks she had memorized. The bent pine with the split trunk, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the place where the creek curved east before curving back north. Each landmark a confirmation, each familiar shape a promise kept. She had walked this path 17 times in her mind, and 17 times with her feet, and now she walked it one final time, with everything she loved in the world following behind her. And then, 2 hours after sunrise, the ravine. It opened in the hillside like a secret, 12 feet wide at the mouth, narrowing as it cut back into the limestone. The walls rose on either side, pale gray stone streaked with mineral deposits, tree roots threading down from above like the fingers of buried giants reaching for water. The morning light fell into the cut at an angle, catching the surface of the creek and throwing patterns of reflected light across the stone walls, so that the ravine seemed to shimmer, seemed to breathe, seemed to be alive in the way that places are alive when they have been waiting for someone to find them. Alara stopped at the entrance and looked down into the cut. The creek ran through the bottom, clear and shallow, catching the morning light. The overhang was visible from here, a dark shelf of rock extending from the east wall, promising shelter, promising safety, promising something that might, with enough work, become a home. "Cale," she said softly, "wake up, sweetheart." Her son raised his head and looked where she was pointing. "That is where we are going," she said. "That is our new house." Cale studied the ravine with the seriousness of a child who has not yet learned that houses are supposed to have walls and doors and windows. He did not see what was missing. He saw only what his mother had promised. "It is like a cave," he said. "It is better than a cave," Alara said. "Caves are dark all the way through. This one has light from above. Caves are always cold. This one faces south for warmth. Caves are lonely. This one has us." She lifted him from the horse and held him for a moment, his small body warm against her chest, his arms wrapped around her neck. She breathed him in, the smell of sleep and boy, and the faintest trace of the lavender soap she had used to wash his hair 2 nights ago in a bathtub in a house that was no longer theirs. "We are going to be safe here," she said. "I promise you. No one will find us. No one will take you from me." Cale did not ask who might try to take him. He simply held on to his mother and believed her, because that is what 4-year-old children do. They believe their mothers. They believe that the arms holding them are strong enough to hold back the entire world. And sometimes, if the mother is determined enough, they are right. Bramble had already gone ahead, picking his way down the ravine slope, finding the path that Alara had walked 17 times before. The sheep milled at the entrance, uncertain, until Alara clicked her tongue and started down, and they followed. Because sheep always follow, even into ravines, even into new lives. The descent took 10 minutes. At the bottom, standing on the limestone rubble beside the creek, looking up at the overhang she had chosen 8 months earlier, Alara allowed herself to breathe. A long breath. The kind of breath that a person takes when they have been holding something inside their chest for so long they have forgotten what it feels like to let it go. They were 70 feet from the Ashford fence line, 70 feet from the property where she had spent 5 years learning to be invisible. 70 feet from the people who had decided she was not worth keeping. They would never know she was here. They would never think to look. The first night in the ravine, Ilara did not sleep. She sat beneath the overhang with kale curled against her side and brambles stretched across their feet, and the sheep huddled at the narrow end of the shelter, their wool providing warmth and the soft sound of their breathing providing something like company. The overhang protected them from the sky, but not from the wind that came through the open mouth of the space, carrying cold air and the smell of changing leaves, and the reminder that winter was coming. And this was not yet a house. This was a ledge of rock. This was a hope. This was a place to stand while she figured out how to make it something more. But Ilara had not come to this ravine without a plan. She had spent 8 months thinking about what it would take to make the overhang livable. She had read the book on farm construction that Aldrich kept in his study and never opened, reading it by candlelight after the household was asleep, memorizing diagrams and measurements and the principles of weight distribution and thermal retention. She had listened to her father's voice in her memory, the lessons he had taught her before sickness took him when she was 19. The knowledge he had passed down from his own father, who had learned to build in Cornwall before crossing the ocean. "Stone does not lie," her father used to say. "Stone tells you what it can do and what it cannot do. Your job is to listen." Ilara looked at the limestone rubble scattered across the ravine floor. Pieces broken from the cliff face by centuries of freezing and thawing, some the size of her fist, some the size of her torso. All of them with flat surfaces where the rock had fractured along its natural planes. Flat surfaces were what she needed. She pulled Kale closer against her side and looked out at the stars, visible through the gap where a wall would stand. She thought about the morning and the work it would bring. She thought about the ticking clock of winter bearing down from the north. She thought about a 4-year-old boy who believed his mother could hold back the entire world. She intended to prove him right. Close enough to hear the Ashford's dogs bark on quiet nights. That was all that separated her from the people who had taken everything, except the one thing she refused to let go. A thin margin of trees and creek and limestone and silence. They would ride their fence lines and never look down. They would post notices in town and search the roads heading east, heading south, heading anywhere but here. They would assume she had run far and fast, the way desperate women always ran. They did not know Ilara Whitmore. They did not know that she had spent 8 months turning desperation into architecture. They did not know that the woman they had dismissed as a carpenter's daughter had inherited more from her father than a name. She had inherited his hands. She had inherited his eye for seeing how pieces fit together. And she had inherited his stubborn, unyielding belief that any empty space could become a room, if you were willing to do the work. Tomorrow, she would begin building the wall. Tonight she held her son and watched the stars and listened to the creek and felt, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the bone-deep ache of everything she had lost, something else, something small and stubborn and refusing to be extinguished, something that felt like the first stone being placed, the foundation of a thing that did not yet exist but would. She would make certain of that. She would build it with her own hands, one stone at a time, one day at a time, until the empty space beneath this overhang became a home, until the place where she was hiding became the place where she was free. The wind moved through the ravine, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the creek sang its ancient song over the stones, and Alara Whitmore held her sleeping son and waited for morning. She began the wall on the second day. The rubble was everywhere. The ravine had spent centuries breaking itself apart, and now she would use the pieces to build something whole. Dry stacked walls did not require mortar. They required patience and the ability to see how one stone would fit against another, how weight would distribute downward, how a structure could rise without anything holding it together except gravity, and the careful selection of each piece. Ilara had watched her father build a wall like this once, when she was 12, a retaining wall behind a church, constructed from recycled cobblestones. He had let her help choose the stones. He had let her place a few of them herself. She remembered the feeling of setting a stone into position and feeling it lock against the stones beneath it, the small satisfaction of weight finding its place, the larger satisfaction of seeing chaos become order, one flat face at a time. Every stone has a right side and a wrong side, her father had said. Your hands will know the difference before your eyes do. She trusted her hands now. The opening she was closing was 20 feet wide. The overhang above was 8 feet tall where it met the ravine wall. She would build the stone wall to 6 feet, leaving the top 2 feet open for light and air, a gap she could seal with canvas in winter and open wide in summer. But first, the doorway. She framed it with 2 flat-faced stones set on end, 3 feet apart, tall enough for her to walk through without ducking. The stones weighed more than she did. She moved them into place using a lever system her father had taught her, logs and fulcrums, and the slow, patient application of force. Working for 6 hours to position 2 pieces of rock that would have taken a crew of farmhands 15 minutes with proper equipment. She did not have equipment. She had a carpenter's adze and knowledge passed down through 2 generations of hands that understood stone. And she had the kind of determination that comes from having nowhere else to go. When the doorway stones were in place, she stood back and looked at them. 2 sentinels of gray limestone framing an entrance to something that did not yet exist. It will be a door, she said to Cale. Our door, no one else's. Cale nodded solemnly. He had not asked when they were going back to the big house. He had not asked about grandmother or grandfather or papa. He seemed to understand, in the way children sometimes understand, without being told, that those names belonged to a life that was over. Can I help carry more stones? He asked. Yes, Ilara said. Find me the flat ones. Her son went to work. He did not speak much. There was too much to do. But occasionally Ilara would pause and look at him. 4 years old, his hands already rough from the work, his face serious with concentration, carrying stones from the creek bed to the wall line, arranging them in piles by size, the way she arranged them, copying her movements with the unconscious precision of a child learning by watching. And she would feel something in her chest that was too large for any single word to hold. This, she thought, this is why I am here. This is why I will make this work. The wall rose slowly, 18 inches thick, 5 courses of stone, each stone chosen for its flat faces, fitted to the stones around it, tested with her hands before she trusted it with the weight of the next course. Her back ached. Her fingers split and bled against the rough limestone. At night, she soaked her hands in the cold creek water and watched the skin tighten and crack, and knew that tomorrow she would do it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the wall was finished or her body gave out, whichever came first. Bramble lay in the sun outside the wall line during the days, watching, his ears alert for any sound that did not belong. The sheep grazed on the sparse grass at the narrow end of the overhang space, and the wall continued to rise. By the end of the second week, the front wall was finished. It ran the full 20 feet of the opening, broken only by the doorway she had framed. 18 inches thick, solid enough that she could push against it with her full weight and feel nothing move. The top 2 feet were left open as planned, a gap that let in pale light and the sound of the wind and the feeling that this was still connected to the world outside. Not a tomb, not a prison, a house that happened to be built into a hillside. Alara stood inside the space and looked at what she had made. 11 feet deep from the front wall to the clay bank at the back, 20 feet wide, narrowing to 12 feet at the far end where the overhang dropped lower. A ceiling of solid limestone above her head, sloping gently from 8 feet at the front to 6 feet at the back. A room. Not finished, not livable yet, but a room. The second problem was already demanding her attention, and this one frightened her more than the wall had. Fire. She needed fire for warmth, for cooking, for light during the long nights that were coming. But fire made smoke, and smoke rose visible against the sky. And smoke rising from a ravine on Ashford property would be seen by anyone riding the fence line. The Ashfords did not ride their fence lines often, but they rode them, and all it would take was one farmhand, one curious visitor, one pair of eyes looking in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. She needed to make fire invisible. Her father had told her a story once about a miner in Cornwall who had survived a collapse by finding an air pocket in the rock. The man had lived for 3 days before rescue, breathing air that filtered through cracks in the stone, fed by the natural ventilation that mountains create when warm air rises and cold air sinks. Hot air rises, her father had said, but if you give it a long enough path, it cools before it gets where it is going. Alara thought about that story for 2 days while she continued other work. She thought about chimneys, which are short vertical paths that carry smoke up fast, keeping it hot, keeping it visible. She thought about what would happen if the path were long instead of short, horizontal instead of vertical. If the smoke had time to cool and disperse before it emerged into the open air. She began to dig. The clay bank behind the overhang was dense and dry, protected from rain by the rock ceiling above, compacted by centuries of its own weight. She cut into it with the adze, not digging a simple hole, but carving a channel. A horizontal passage that ran straight back into the bank. The first attempt failed. 8 feet in, she angled the channel upward and found an exit point through a crack in the limestone. She sealed the connection between the channel and the firebox she had built from flat stones, lit a small fire, and climbed out of the ravine to check. The smoke was clearly visible, a thin gray column rising from the crack in the rock, catching the morning light, announcing her presence to anyone within a quarter-mile. She could see it from the property road. She could see it from the fence line. She could see it from everywhere that mattered. Her stomach dropped. The wall had taken 2 weeks. Winter was close enough now that she could feel it in the mornings, in the way the air bit at her fingers when she washed at the creek, in the way Cale pressed closer to her at night. If she could not solve the smoke, the wall meant nothing. The shelter meant nothing. She would have to choose between freezing in silence and burning in discovery. She sat on the ravine rim for a long time, looking at the smoke, thinking. Her father's voice in her memory. Hot air rises, but if you give it a long enough path. She had not given it enough path. 8 feet was not enough. The smoke needed more distance, more contact with cool earth, more time to lose its heat and its coherence before it reached the open air. She went back down and sealed the first channel with packed clay. Then she started again. 6 more days. 6 days of cutting into the dense clay with the adze, her arms shaking with fatigue by the end of each session, her hands blistered and bleeding in new places. Cale played nearby, building castles from the clay scraps, his imagination turning rubble into kingdoms, while his mother turned a hillside into a home. He did not understand what she was doing. He did not need to. He simply stayed close and kept her company and reminded her, by his presence alone, why she could not afford to fail again. 14 feet. That was how far the second channel ran. At the far end, she angled it upward, following what felt like the natural grain of the earth, emerging through a crack in the limestone 12 feet above the ravine floor. She had chosen the exit point carefully. An oak tree had grown at the ravine's edge, its roots pushing down into the rock, creating a screen of wood and earth and entangled growth that would hide anything emerging from below. She sealed the new channel, built a small fire in the firebox, climbed out of the ravine and walked to the oak and stood there, waiting. The smoke that emerged was barely visible, a thin haze, cooled by 14 feet of passage through dense clay, dispersing through the root system of the oak, mixing with the morning mist that rose from the creek every day at dawn. From 10 feet away, it was nearly invisible. From the property road, 100 yards distant, it did not exist. Ilara stood beneath the oak for a long time, watching nothing happen, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks, a tightness she had carried since the morning she lit that first fire and saw her hiding place announced to the sky. They would not see her. They would not find her. She had built herself a house that could breathe without being noticed, that could burn without being discovered, that could keep her son warm without announcing their presence to the world. She was home. Orrin Halsey entered her life on a cold morning several weeks later. She needed things she could not make or find in the ravine: salt for preserving food, needles and thread for the sewing work that would become her income, a few dollars worth of flour and sugar and coffee, small things that would make the difference between surviving and living. She could not go to town herself. Someone might recognize her. Someone might remember the woman who had married Cedric Ashford and then vanished. Someone might connect her face to the notices that Sheriff Gareth Cade had posted around town. But she had heard of Orrin Halsey. Her father had known him years ago, when both men were younger and the world was different. A dry goods merchant, a quiet man, a man who, according to her father, understood that some questions were better left unasked. She went to his store on a rainy morning, wearing a shawl over her head, entering through the back door she had spotted on an earlier visit to the edge of the town. Cale stayed in the ravine with Bramble, the first time she had left him alone. The first test of whether the hiding place she had built could hold without her there to watch it. Orrin Halsey was 65 years old, gray-bearded, with eyes that had seen enough to know when they were seeing something unusual. He looked up when Ilara entered and did not seem surprised that a woman had come through his back door in the rain. "You are Tobias Thorne's daughter," he said. It was not a question. There was no point in hiding from a man who had already recognized her. "Yes," she said, "I am." "I heard you married an Ashford." "I did. That is over now." Orrin nodded slowly. He did not ask what had ended the marriage. He did not ask where she was living, or why she had come through the back door, or what she was running from. He simply waited for her to tell him what she needed. "I need supplies," Ilara said. "I can pay. And I need work. Sewing work. I am good at it." "I know," Orrin said. "Your father told me once that your stitches were tighter than any tailor he had seen." "He said that?" "He said many things about you." He was proud. Something shifted in Ilara's chest. Her father had been dead for 6 years. She had not known he had spoken of her to anyone. She had not known anyone remembered. "I can bring finished work to you," she said. "You can sell it without saying who made it. I will take whatever price you think is fair. And where should I send word if someone has a special order?" This was the moment of trust. This was the moment when she would either find an ally or create an enemy. "There is a hollow beneath a rock at the edge of your property," she said. "The rock with the split top, near the old fence post. I can check it regularly." Orrin studied her for a long moment. Then he reached beneath his counter and pulled out a small notebook. He wrote something in it, tore out the page, and handed it to her. "North Ravine. Do not disturb." "That is what I will write in my ledger," he said. "That is all anyone will ever find if they come looking." She would burn that paper later in the firebox that sent its smoke through 14 feet of clay into the roots of an oak tree. But she would remember the words and the man who wrote them for as long as she lived. "Your father was a good man," Orrin said. "His daughter deserves a chance to be one too." While Ilara built her hidden life, the town built its version of her story. Maeve Redmond, who owned the fabric shop on the main street, had theories. She shared them with anyone who would listen. She shared them while measuring cloth, and while wrapping packages, and while standing in line at the post office. Maeve had a gift for imagining the worst possible outcomes and presenting them as the most likely ones. "Poor thing, probably threw herself in the river," she told her customers. "A woman that desperate, cast out by her own family, what else would she do?" Maeve shook her head sadly as she said these things, but her eyes were bright with the pleasure of speculation. She did not consider that Ilara's silence during her years in the Ashford house might have been the silence of a woman who knew she was being watched and judged. She did not consider that some people are quiet because speaking has never helped them. Sheriff Gareth Cade kept the notice posted on the board outside his office. Woman sought for questioning regarding removal of minor child from lawful custody. He was 48 years old, experienced enough to know that women who disappeared with children usually went far and fast. But the notice stayed up because procedure was procedure, and the Ashfords were important people. And Reverend Cray added his voice to the chorus. He was 55 years old, a man who believed that moral certainty was the same thing as moral correctness. He preached a sermon about the sanctity of family and the sin of breaking bonds. He did not name Ilara specifically from the pulpit. He did not need to. Everyone in the congregation knew exactly who he meant. A woman who abandons her husband's family abandons the natural order, he intoned, his voice filling the small church. Such women find no peace. Dorothea Ashford sat in the front pew and nodded along with every word. Cedric sat beside his mother and studied his hands. He did not nod. He did not look up. He simply sat and endured, the way he had always sat and endured. But Reverend Cray did something after the sermon that was different from the others. He did not simply gossip and move on. He began asking questions. Quiet questions, the kind that made people feel they were confessing rather than simply making conversation. He visited Orrin Halsey's store and inquired about unusual purchases. He asked farmhands along the north properties whether they had seen anything out of the ordinary. He spoke with Maeve Redmond about fabric and thread and who in the area did sewing work for pay. He did not find answers. Not yet. But he found the shape of answers. He found the outline of a space where someone might be hiding. And he continued to watch. None of them imagined that the woman they were discussing was living 70 feet from the Ashford property line. None of them imagined that she could hear the church bells on Sunday mornings if the wind was right. None of them imagined that she was warmer and safer than she had ever been in the house where they had forced her to feel small. Old Nessa Craig came to Orrin Halsey's store on a cold morning several weeks later. She was 78 years old, the oldest woman in the area, a relic from a time when people remembered how to survive without doctors and medicines, and all the conveniences that modern life provided. She moved slowly, but her eyes were sharp, and she noticed things that younger people overlooked. She bought flour and salt and a length of cotton fabric, and she paused at the counter to examine the stitching on a shirt that Orrin had for sale. The stitching was tight and even, the kind of work that came from years of practice and a steady hand. "This work," she said, running her thumb along the seam. "Who did this?" Orrin looked at the shirt. "A seamstress," he said carefully. "Does good work." Nessa studied the stitching for a long moment. Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp enough to see what mattered, traced the line of thread through fabric. "Old ways," she said quietly. "Cornwall ways. My grandmother sewed like this. Brought the technique over on the boat." Orrin said nothing. He had learned over many years that saying nothing was often the safest response when people started making observations. Nessa set down the shirt. She looked at Oren with an expression that suggested she understood considerably more than she was saying. "Whoever she is," Nessa said, "tell her she is doing it right. Tell her the old ways always come back. They come back because they work." Oren stood behind his counter for a long time after Nessa left. He thought about the woman in the ravine. He thought about old ways and new difficulties and the strange persistence of knowledge that should have been forgotten but never quite was. He wrote a note that evening and left it in the hollow beneath the rock. "Old woman in town recognizes your work, says you are doing it right. The old ways work. Keep going." It was not much, but sometimes not much was everything. The survey crew arrived on a morning several weeks later. 3 men with equipment and loud voices, and the particular confidence of people who believed no one was listening. Ilara heard them before she saw them. Voices carrying down from the ravine rim, the sound of metal equipment being set up. She had just returned from the creek with water. Kale was inside the house, practicing letters on a slate she had purchased through Oren. Bramble was sleeping in the sun outside the door. The dog's head came up first. His ears rotated toward the sound. A low growl started in his chest. "Kale, inside. Quiet, now." Her son looked up from his slate. He did not ask questions. He had learned not to ask questions when his mother's voice sounded like that. He set down the chalk and moved to the back of the room, pressing himself against the clay wall, making himself small. "Bramble, come." The dog rose and followed her inside. She pulled the canvas panel across the doorway, the panel she had hung for cold nights, the panel that from outside would look like shadow, like nothing, like a trick of the light in a place where light behaves strangely. Then she listened. The voices were clearer now. 3 men, she thought, maybe 4. They were discussing boundary markers, property lines, the legal language of land that belongs to someone. "Should we go down there?" one voice asked. "The ravine runs through this section. Survey notes say non-arable drainage. Nothing to measure down there except water and rock." Another voice, older, tired. "Might be interesting, though. Never been in that particular cut." A third voice, younger, curious. Ilara's heart stopped. She felt it stop, felt the blood pause in her veins, felt the air freeze in her lungs, felt the entire world hold its breath while she waited for the next words. Her hand was pressed over Kale's mouth, not because he was making noise, but because she needed something to hold, something to grip while the universe decided whether to destroy her. "We do not get paid for interesting." The older voice again, impatient. "We get paid for boundary markers. Ravine is internal to the property, nothing to mark. Let us move on." A pause, long enough for Ilara to imagine the curious one looking down, seeing the creek, seeing the walls, seeing the impossible edge of a stone structure where no stone structure should be. Then footsteps moving away, voices fading, the sound of equipment being packed up and carried off. Ilara did not move. She stayed frozen against the wall for 5 minutes. 10. 20. The ravine was silent except for the creek and the wind and the sound of her own heartbeat gradually slowing. She lowered her hand from Kale's mouth and looked at her son. His eyes were very large in the dim light. His breath was coming fast and shallow. "Mama," he whispered, "I was scared." "I know," she said. "I was scared too." "Did we do something wrong?" Ilara thought about how to answer, thought about property law and custody and the rights of mothers and the power of men who own land and use that ownership like weapons. "No," she said finally, "we did not do something wrong. We are just keeping a secret. Sometimes secrets are important. Sometimes secrets keep people safe." Kale considered this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old trying to understand an adult world. "Like when you made my birthday cake and I was not supposed to tell Papa." "Yes," Ilara said, "like that. Except this secret is bigger. This secret is the biggest secret you will ever keep." Her son nodded slowly. He reached out and took her hand in his small one. "I can keep it," he said. "I am good at secrets." "I know you are," Ilara said. "I know." In the weeks that followed, Ilara turned her attention to the things that would keep them alive through the cold months ahead. She dug a shallow channel from the creek into the shelter, lining it with flat stones to create a path for clean water that ended in a small basin she had carved from the clay floor. The water ran slow but steady, enough for drinking and cooking without the need to carry buckets from the creek in weather that would soon make the path treacherous with ice. She built shelves into the clay bank at the back of the shelter, cutting them with the adze, smoothing them with her hands, creating alcoves deep enough to store food where the temperature held constant. The deep clay stayed cool in a way that the open air did not, holding steady at a temperature that kept meat from spoiling and vegetables from wilting. She salted fish from the creek and hung strips of dried venison from pegs she had driven into the clay. She stored root vegetables in baskets lined with dry grass. She organized everything by how long it would last, placing the things that would spoil first at the front and the things that would keep longest at the back. Because in a life where every decision carried the weight of survival, even the arrangement of food on a shelf was a form of planning. Some mornings, when the wind blew from the south, she could hear the church bells in town. The sound carried down the ravine like a reminder that the world she had left behind was still turning, still looking, still waiting for her to make a mistake. On those mornings, she worked faster. Kale helped. He carried water from the creek in a small pail she had fashioned from bark and pitch. He arranged stones around the firebox to keep the heat directed inward. He stacked firewood against the inside of the stone wall, learning, without being taught, that wood stored inside stayed dry, and wood stored outside did not, and that the difference between dry wood and wet wood was the difference between a warm night and a cold one. He was 4 years old and already learning the language of survival. Not through lectures or lessons, but through the daily rhythm of a life that required every pair of hands to contribute something. Ilara watched him work and felt the impossible weight of what she was asking of him, and the impossible pride of watching him carry it without complaint. The cold came. It settled over the hills with a weight that felt personal. The temperature dropped and stayed dropped. The creek slowed in the shallow places. The wind that came through the gap at the top of the wall carried the kind of cold that found every opening in clothing, every crack in shelter, every weakness in preparation. But the firebox system worked. The clay walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. The 14-foot chimney channel cooled the smoke to nothing before it reached the open air. The stone wall blocked the worst of the wind. The gap at the top let in light without letting in weather, and the canvas panel she had hung could be lowered to seal it when the wind turned vicious. 50 degrees inside when the world outside dropped to zero. A thermal battery of stone and clay and careful engineering that required only periodic stoking to maintain. Her father's knowledge, filtered through her mother's patience, built by her own hands in a place no one knew existed. Ilara stood inside the shelter on the first truly bitter night and felt the warmth press against her skin like a living thing. She looked at Cale, asleep on the pallet she had made from wool and dried grass. Bramble curled at his feet, the firelight painting their faces in shades of amber and shadow. She looked at the walls she had built, the shelves she had carved, the food she had stored, the water running slow and clear through the channel she had dug. She had done this, all of it, with $51 and a carpenter's adze, and knowledge that had been passed down through hands that never stopped working. The shelter was not perfect. The wind still found its way through gaps she had not yet sealed. The floor was cold stone that numbed her feet on the worst mornings. The light was never quite enough, and the space was never quite large enough. And there were moments, usually in the hour before dawn, when the fire burned lowest and the darkness pressed closest, when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But then Cale would stir in his sleep and reach for her hand, and she would hold it and remember why she was here, and the doubt would pass the way cold passes when you feed the fire, slowly at first, and then all at once. The wall stood, the fire burned, the smoke disappeared, and winter, for all its weight and fury, could not reach them. Outside, in the town, Reverend Cray continued his quiet investigation. He had not yet found what he was looking for, but he was patient, and patience was the one thing he shared with the woman he was hunting, though neither of them would have appreciated the comparison. He kept a small notebook in his breast pocket, and in it he wrote the things he noticed. The regularity of certain purchases at Orrin Halsey's store, the quality of sewing work that appeared on the counter without a name attached, the way Orrin's eyes shifted when anyone asked about seamstresses in the area. Cray did not confront. He did not accuse. He simply watched and wrote and waited, building a case the way Ilara built walls. One piece at a time, one observation at a time, one small certainty stacked carefully upon another. Spring was coming, and with spring would come the new property owner, and the new manager, and new eyes looking at land that had been ignored for years. The ravine would not stay hidden forever. Ilara knew that. She had always known that. But she had bought herself time, and time was the only currency that mattered when you were building something from nothing. She looked at the wall she had raised. She looked at the chimney that breathed without being seen. She looked at her son, growing stronger every day in a home carved from the earth by his mother's hands. Time. She needed more of it. She would fight for every hour. Cale woke on a morning deep in the cold season with a cough that sounded like something tearing. By evening, the cough had become a fever. By midnight, the fever had climbed so high that Ilara could feel the heat radiating from his skin before her hand even touched his forehead. She knelt beside his bed and pressed a wet cloth against his face and watched the cloth grow warm in seconds, as if his body were a stove that someone had stoked beyond reason. She had prepared for cold. She had prepared for hunger. She had prepared for discovery and for loneliness, and for the particular kind of despair that comes from building something with your own hands and wondering every night if it will be enough. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for the sound of her son's breathing turning shallow and fast, or the way his small body shook beneath the blankets, or the look in his eyes when he opened them briefly and did not seem to recognize where he was. "Mama," he said, but the word came out broken, split by a cough that doubled him over and left him gasping. "I am here," she said. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." She tore strips from her own dress to make more cooling cloths. She soaked them in the creek water that ran through the channel she had dug. Water so cold it numbed her hands to the wrists. And she pressed them against his forehead and his chest and the backs of his knees where the blood ran close to the surface. She changed the cloths every few minutes when the fever ate through them. She talked to him through the hours because silence was unbearable, because the sound of her own voice proved that someone was still here, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. She told him about his grandfather, not the things she had already told herself 100 times, the walls, the techniques, the lessons in stone. Instead, she told him the things she had not spoken aloud since she was a girl. His grandfather's laugh, which was rare and sudden and sounded like a bark. The way the man could sit in silence for an hour studying a piece of wood before making a single cut. The morning he had carried Ilara on his shoulders through a thunderstorm, and she had not been afraid, because his hands held her the way they held everything, as if letting go were simply not an option. She told him about her mother, who had survived 3 weeks of childbed fever and lived to see Ilara married. She told him about the day she found Bramble in the woods, with his leg bloodied and his eyes wild, and how she had carried the dog back to the barn and nursed him for 3 weeks, and how the dog had repaid that kindness every day since by refusing to leave her side. Bramble lay beside the bed now, his chin resting on the edge of the pallet, his eyes fixed on Cale with the unwavering attention of a creature who understands illness without understanding medicine. He had not moved since the fever began. He had not eaten. He simply watched the boy who had been his companion since the day they arrived in this place, and waited. The first night passed like a year. Dawn came gray and thin through the gap in the wall. Ilara had not slept. Cale had not improved. His cough had become deeper, wetter, the sound of something settling in his lungs. His fever had not broken. She pressed her palm against his forehead and felt the heat pulse beneath his skin like a second heartbeat, too fast, too fierce, burning through him with an intensity that terrified her. She looked at her son. She looked at the door. She looked at the path that led out of the ravine and up to the road that led to town, where a doctor lived 7 miles away, 5 if you knew the paths through the woods. She could carry Cale that distance. She could walk into town and beg for help and let everyone see her. Let everyone know where she had been hiding. Let everyone tell the Ashfords that the woman they had cast out was not gone after all. She could save her son by destroying everything she had built. Or she could stay in the ravine and trust that the fever would break on its own, the way fevers sometimes did. The way her own fever had broken when she was 7, and her mother had sat beside her bed for 3 days and 3 nights without sleeping. Elara knew now what her mother had felt during those 3 days. She knew it completely. Kneeling beside Cale's bed, watching his small chest rise and fall too quickly, watching his face flush red and then go pale and then flush again, feeling his forehead burn against her palm like a coal that refused to cool no matter how many wet cloths she pressed against it. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, "to no one, to everyone, to whatever force governed the world beyond the walls she had built. Please, not him. Take anything else from me. Take everything else. But not him, not my boy." One more day, she told herself, one more day, and if he is not better, she would take him to the doctor. She would let them see her. She would let them take everything except him. One more day. The second day was worse. Cale stopped eating. He would not take water. His cough became deeper and wetter, and each fit left him weaker than the one before. His small body spending energy it could not afford on a battle it showed no sign of winning. His fever climbed higher, and Elara ran out of clean cloths for cooling and had to tear more strips from her dress until the garment hung in tatters around her, and she did not care. Because clothing was nothing. Modesty was nothing. Everything was nothing compared to the child lying on the bed with heat pouring from his skin like light from a lantern turned up too high. She talked to him through the second day and the second night. Stories about the ravine, about the wall she had built, about the stones she had chosen one by one, and the way they fit together like pieces of a puzzle designed by the earth itself. She talked about his grandfather's hands, which were large and rough, and could hold a stone with the same gentleness they held a child. She talked about the chimney channel, how she had dug it twice because the first time was not enough. How failure was not the end of anything, but only the middle, only the space between trying and trying again. She talked because silence was a door she could not afford to open. If she stopped talking, the silence would fill with all the thoughts she was holding back. The thought that she had brought her son to this place to save him, and this place was going to kill him. The thought that she had built walls to keep the world out, and the walls were keeping help out too. The thought that the irony of dying in a shelter was too cruel to bear, but was bearing down on them anyway, and she could feel its weight like the weight of the limestone ceiling above her head. Cale did not respond to her stories. His eyes stayed closed. His breathing stayed shallow and fast. His small body burned with heat that should have consumed him entirely, and Elara knelt beside him and held his hand and felt the fever pulse beneath his skin, and wondered if she was holding on or letting go. The third night was the longest of her life. She sat beside Cale's bed and held his hand, and listened to his breathing and counted each breath, because counting was the only thing she could control. 14 breaths a minute, then 16, then 20. Too fast, too shallow, each breath carrying less air than the one before. Each breath a small withdrawal from a reserve that was running dangerously low. She knew, with the certainty that comes when hope has exhausted itself and reality begins to seep through the cracks, that she was losing him. If he dies here, she thought, no one will know. No one will bury him properly. No one will say his name over his grave, or tell stories about the boy he might have become. She had brought him to this ravine to save him. She had hidden him from the world to protect him. And now, the world's absence was going to kill him. She had built walls against everything except the one thing that could reach them anywhere. The invisible enemy that traveled through air and lodged in lungs, and did not care whether those lungs belonged to a king's son or a fugitive's child. At 3 a.m, in the darkest hour of the darkest night, Ilara made a decision. She would take him to town. She would walk into the streets with her dying son in her arms, and she would beg for help, and she would accept whatever consequences came. She would lose the ravine. She would lose her freedom. She would probably lose Cale to the Ashfords anyway, if he survived, which seemed less and less likely with every shallow breath he took. But she would not let him die alone in a hole in the ground, while she watched helplessly. She would not let the last thing he felt be the cold clay wall against his back and the sound of his mother crying in the dark. She stood up from the chair. She turned toward the bed to lift her son, and Cale opened his eyes. "Mama," he said. His voice was thin and dry, but present, alive, unmistakably alive. "I am hungry." The fever had broken. It had broken sometime in the hour she had sat beside him, preparing to sacrifice everything. It had broken while she was making peace with giving up. It had broken because fevers sometimes break, because bodies sometimes fight back, because 4-year-old children are stronger than they look, and more determined than anyone gives them credit for. Ilara collapsed beside the bed and wept. She wept for the first time since leaving the Ashford house. She wept for months of hidden fear and quiet desperation, and the relentless work of staying alive. She wept for the night she had just survived, and the years she still had to survive, and the uncertainty of a future she could not see or control. Bramble rose from his spot and pushed his nose against her hand, whining softly. Confused by tears, but determined to offer comfort. Cale watched his mother cry with the bewilderment of a child who has been very sick and has woken to find the world changed in ways he cannot understand. "Mama," he said, "are you sad?" "No," Ilara said, wiping her face. "No, baby, I am happy. I am so very happy." "Then why are you crying?" She looked at her son, thin from 3 days without eating, pale from 3 days of fever, alive. "Because sometimes," she said, "happy and crying are the same thing. Cale considered this. He seemed to accept it, the way children accept many things that adults find complicated. "Can I have soup?" he asked. "Yes," Elara said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, you can have soup. You can have all the soup in the world." She did not sleep for 2 more days. She sat beside Cale and watched him recover, watched the color return to his face, watched his appetite return, watched him become again the child she had risked everything to keep. And she thought about what she had almost done. She had almost walked into town. She had almost revealed herself. She had almost given up the ravine, the hidden life, the freedom she had built with her own hands. For her son, she would have done it. For her son, she would do anything. But the fever broke, and the crisis passed, and the world continued turning. And she would remember this night forever. She would remember that she had a line she would not cross. And the line was not the ravine, or the wall, or the freedom. The line was her son's life. Everything else could be sacrificed. Everything else could be rebuilt. But not him. Never him. Years passed in the ravine, the way water passes over stone. They carved channels. They smoothed rough edges. They changed everything while appearing to change nothing at all. Cale grew. At 5, he could read simple sentences from books Elara purchased through Orin. At 6, he could write his name and do sums on his slate, and identify every plant that grew along the ravine rim by sight and smell. At 7, he helped his mother repair the stone wall when winter frost loosened the joints, choosing stones with the same quiet concentration she remembered in her father's hands. At 8, he began asking questions that did not have easy answers. "Why do we live here, Mama?" "Because it is safe." "Safe from what?" "From people who would try to take you away from me." He did not ask who. He had learned by then that some questions carried weight his mother was not yet ready to set down. Bramble grew older alongside the boy. The copper-colored hound who had followed them into the ravine as a young dog became a middle-aged dog, his muzzle showing the first traces of gray, his movements slower on cold mornings. But he still positioned himself between Cale and any unfamiliar sound. He still growled softly at shadows that moved in ways they should not. He was still, in every way that mattered, standing guard. And then the news came that changed everything. Aldrich Ashford was dead. Elara learned this through the usual method, a note from Orin left in the hollow beneath the rock. She read it standing in the woods, her hands trembling slightly. Aldrich Ashford, stroke, dead 3 days. Property sold to a merchant named Desmond Collier. New management expected. She read the note twice, then 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket to burn later. She waited to feel something. Relief, vindication, the dark satisfaction of outlasting someone who had tried to erase her from existence. She felt nothing. Aldrich Ashford's death changed nothing for her. Not yet. Dorothea was still alive somewhere. The law was still what it had always been. A woman who had taken her child without permission. A woman who had hidden on property that was not hers. Nothing had changed, except everything was about to change. The new owner sent a manager. Slade Hargrave was 35 years old, experienced in farm operations, thorough in his methods, and meticulous in his record-keeping. Unlike previous caretakers who visited twice a year and ignored anything not actively on fire, Hargrave believed in knowing every inch of the land he supervised. He walked the fence lines monthly. He inspected outbuildings quarterly. He kept detailed notes on soil conditions, water flow, timber quality, and any unusual features of the terrain. His notes, after his first visit to the north end of the property, included the following observation. Stone structure beneath overhang on east wall of ravine. Appears to be old livestock shelter. Signs of recent use uncertain but possible. Recommend follow-up inspection. Word of the structure spread through the property workers that spring. Colm Dre heard about it in the bunkhouse. He was 19 years old, one of the seasonal farmhands Hargrave had hired, young enough to be curious and restless enough to wonder about mysteries. "I saw smoke coming from that ravine one morning," he said one evening. "Early, before full dawn. Looked like someone might be living down there." The other hands laughed. "Ghosts," one of them said. "Living in an old cowshed." "Maybe," Colm said. "Or maybe someone who does not want to be found." He thought about riding down to check. He thought about the recognition that might come from discovering something Hargrave had missed. But the work was hard, and the days were long, and by the time he had a free afternoon, he had forgotten about the smoke and the stone walls and the possibility of someone living where no one should be living. Some discoveries are missed, not through lack of curiosity, but through lack of time. Hargrave himself returned to the ravine weeks later. Ilara heard him coming. She had developed an instinct for sounds that did not belong, an ability to distinguish between the footsteps of deer and the footsteps of men, between the rustle of wind in leaves and the rustle of a body moving through brush with purpose. She pulled Cale into the back of the house, behind the clay partition she had constructed for exactly this purpose. She pressed her hand over Bramble's muzzle to keep him from growling. She held her breath and waited. Hargrave walked the length of the structure. She could hear his boots on the stone floor of the entrance area outside. She could hear him pause at the doorway. She could hear the scratch of pencil on paper as he made notes. Then he left. His notes from that visit read, "Stone structure stable. No definite signs of current habitation. Previous assessment of old livestock shelter appears accurate. No action required at this time." He had stood 3 feet from a woman holding her breath and a child pressing his face into his mother's shoulder, and a dog trembling with the effort of not growling. And he had seen nothing. Because he was looking for evidence of habitation as he understood it. Garbage, damage, the marks that careless people leave on spaces they do not respect. Ilara had left none of those marks. Her space was clean and ordered and maintained with the care of someone who understood that survival depended on invisibility, and invisibility depended on discipline. But she knew. Standing in the darkness behind the clay partition, listening to his footsteps fade up the ravine slope, she knew that the world was closing in. One person at a time, one observation at a time, one note in a ledger at a time. Then Orrin Halsey died. He went quietly, sitting in the chair behind his counter where he had sat for decades of business and decades of kept secrets. His daughter-in-law, Bridget, found him when she came to bring his dinner. She said he looked peaceful, like he had just closed his eyes to rest. The store closed for a week. Bridget, who was 32 and had helped run the business for years, began sorting through his papers. She found the ledger with the note, "North Ravine, do not disturb." She found the accounts showing payments to L. Thorne, years of small transactions that added up to something larger. She found the careful records of a secret kept faithfully. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough to know that her father-in-law had been helping someone, and that the help had been given without questions. She placed a notice in the local paper. L. Thorne, please contact Halsey's Dry Goods regarding uncollected funds. Amount, $87. She meant it as kindness. She did not know it was a signal flare. Reverend Cray read the notice. He was a man who read everything, who collected information the way other men collected stamps or coins. He remembered the name, Thorne, Ilara Thorne, the woman who had married Cedric Ashford and then disappeared with the boy, the woman who had been searched for and never found, the woman who was assumed dead or gone, or both. L. Thorne, living somewhere close enough to place work at Orrin Halsey's counter for years, living somewhere close enough to check for messages and pick up payments, living somewhere. He began asking questions more pointedly now. He spoke with Bridget about the sewing work. He spoke with Calm Dre about the smoke he had seen. He spoke with Hargrave about the stone structure in the North Ravine. And slowly, the way a man assembles a wall from scattered stones, he built a picture. Reverend Cray came to the ravine on a morning when the light was clear and the air was still, and sound carried farther than it should have. Ilara heard him on the slope. One set of footsteps, deliberate, not hurrying. The walk of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has thought carefully about what he will say when he gets there. She did not hide this time. She did not pull Cale behind the partition or press her hand over Bramble's muzzle. She stood in the doorway of the house she had built and waited. Cray appeared at the base of the ravine. He was dressed in black, as he always was, his coat buttoned to the throat, his hat held in both hands in front of him. He looked at the wall. He looked at the doorway. He looked at the woman standing in it. "I know someone is here," he said. His voice was quiet, not accusing, not triumphant, just certain. "I have known for some time." "Then you know," Ilara said. "And now you have to decide what to do about it." Cray walked closer. He stopped 10 feet from the doorway and studied the structure with the careful attention of a man who appreciates craft, even when he disapproves of its purpose. His eyes moved across the dry stacked wall, the fitted stones, the framed doorway. He looked up at the gap where light entered. He looked at the ground, clean and swept, and free of the debris that would mark an abandoned shelter. "The boy," he said, "Cale Ashford. He is here. His name is Cale. He is here. He is healthy. He is alive. The law says he belongs with his father's family. The law says many things. Not all of them are just." Cray was quiet for a moment. "I have a duty," he said, "a moral obligation. A child was taken from lawful custody. I cannot simply look away." "Then do not look away," Ilara said. She stepped to the side of the doorway. "Come inside. Look." Cray hesitated. Then he stepped through the doorway into the house that Ilara had built inside a ravine 70 feet from the Ashford fence line. Cale was sitting on the stone bench she had built against the east wall. He was reading. A book of simple stories that she had purchased through Oren months earlier, the pages worn soft from handling. He looked up when Cray entered, and his eyes went first to his mother, reading her face the way he had learned to read it over 5 years of hidden life. Whatever he found there, calm, control, the absence of the particular tension that meant hide, settled him. He looked at the visitor without fear, because his mother was not afraid, and that was enough. The boy was 8 years old now. His dark hair fell across his forehead the way his mother's did. His hands were calloused from work. His face was tanned from the hours he spent outside, gathering wood, carrying water, learning the names of every plant that grew in the ravine and along its rim. He was thin, but not malnourished. He was quiet, but not withdrawn. He was, by every visible measure, a child who was cared for. "Cale," Ilara said, "this is a visitor. Can you show him your writing?" Cale set down his book and picked up his slate. He held it up for Cray to see. The letters were neat and evenly spaced, written in a hand that spoke of practice and patience, and a mother who had made education a priority, even in hiding. Cray looked at the slate. He looked at the shelves carved into the clay wall, stocked with preserved food. He looked at the firebox and the chimney channel that disappeared into the earth. He looked at the bed, neatly made, the clothes clean and mended, the water running through the stone-lined channel. He looked at all of it, and Ilara watched him look, and she did not speak, because the room was speaking for her. "You built this," Cray said. It was not a question. "Yes." "By yourself?" "With these hands. Every stone, every shelf, every foot of that chimney channel through the clay." Cray turned back to face her. His expression had changed. The certainty was still there, the moral architecture that held his worldview in place. But something else was there too. Something that looked like the first crack in a wall that has been standing too long under too much weight. "You preach about the natural order," Ilara said. Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for years, but now that it was here, she did not need the rehearsal. The words came from somewhere deeper than preparation. "You stood in your church and told your congregation that a woman who leaves her husband's family has abandoned everything sacred. Look at this child. Look at this place. And tell me, which order serves him better? A house where his mother was erased from existence, or this?" Cray did not answer immediately. He looked at Cale again. The boy had gone back to his book, uninterested in adult conversations, secure in the belief that his mother would handle whatever this was the way she handled everything. With competence, with calm, with the quiet certainty of a person who has been tested and has not broken. "I will pray on it," Cray said finally. He did not promise to keep her secret. He did not promise to reveal it. He simply turned and walked out of the doorway and up the ravine slope and disappeared over the rim, his black coat vanishing into the tree line like a shadow returning to the place it came from. Ilara stood in the doorway for a long time after he was gone. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, though fear was part of it. From the effort of holding steady through a confrontation she had imagined 1,000 times and survived only once. From the knowledge that the next days would determine everything. Cray would pray, and his prayer would lead him to a decision. And that decision would either preserve her life or destroy it. And she had no control over which way it fell. She had done what she could. She had shown him the truth. The rest was his. Cedric Ashford found her 3 days later. She was at the creek, filling water buckets, a routine she had followed hundreds of times. The walk upstream to where the water ran clear over smooth gravel. Fill the buckets, walk back. A task that took 30 minutes and felt like freedom. Those few moments in the open air, away from the overhang, away from the walls that protected her and confined her in equal measure. She did not hear him approach. The creek was loud here, running fast over rocks, masking other sounds. She looked up, and Cedric was standing 10 feet away. Time stopped. That was how she would remember it later. Time stopped, and the world held its breath, and the creek continued running. But everything else became perfectly, impossibly still. He was older than she remembered. There was gray in his hair that had not been there before, lines around his eyes that spoke of years she knew nothing about. The particular wearing down that happens to people who have spent too long failing themselves. Ilara, he said, her name in his mouth. The first time she had heard anyone speak her full name in years. It sounded strange, foreign, like a word from a language she had almost forgotten. "You are alive," he said. "Yes." "You have been here the whole time." "Yes." "Cale, is he alive? Is he healthy?" "He is alive. He is healthy. He is happy. He is mine." Cedric flinched, the flinch of a man who knows he deserves worse than words and is receiving only words. "I am not here to take him," he said. "I did not know you were here. I did not know you were anywhere. I came to sign papers. The property is sold. I am finished with all of it." "Then go. Sign your papers. Finish what you came to finish." Cedric did not move. He stood at the edge of the creek with his hands at his sides and looked at the woman he had married and failed and never stopped thinking about in all the years since she had vanished. "I could help," he said. "I have money. Not much, but some. I could send something every month. I could—" "No, Ilara, please, let me do something." "No." She said it firmly. Finally. The word she had wanted to say for 5 years, in the parlor when Aldrich pronounced his verdict, in the hallway when Cedric said nothing, in the bedroom where she had packed her life into a single bag while her husband sat by a window and watched. "You do not get to help now. You do not get to make this right. There is nothing you have that I want. There is nothing you can give that I need. There must be something." She looked at him, looked at the man who had once promised to love and protect her, the man who had sat silent while his parents claimed their son. "There is one thing," she said. "Name it. Be silent. Go back to wherever you came from. Do not tell anyone you saw me here. Do not tell anyone I exist. For once in your life, do the thing that will cost you nothing and help someone else." Cedric was quiet for a long moment. She watched him absorb what she was asking. watched him weigh it against whatever he had imagined this conversation would be. "I can do that," he said finally. "If that is what you want, I can do that." "Good. Is he happy?" The question came out rough, as if it had been lodged in his throat for years. "Cale, is he really happy?" "Yes, he is happy. He does not remember you. He does not remember any of you. He knows only this life, and this life is good." Cedric nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted, settled. The look of a man accepting something he did not want to accept, but accepting it nonetheless. "Then I am glad," he said. "I am glad you took him. I am glad you kept him. I am glad he does not remember a father who did not deserve to be remembered." He turned and walked away. He did not look back. He simply walked up the bank and into the trees and became nothing but the sound of footsteps fading into distance. Ilara stood by the creek for a long time after he was gone. She did not pick up the buckets. She did not walk back to the ravine. She simply stood in the place where her old life had finally found her, and her new life had held firm. Cedric would keep his word. She knew that about him at least. He was weak, but he was not dishonest. He would sign his papers, and he would not tell anyone what he had seen. But she was counting now. Cray knew. Slade Hargrave suspected. Bridget had the ledger. Cedric knew. Colm Dre had seen smoke. Too many threads. Too many people holding pieces of a secret that was never meant to be shared. She had maybe a year. Maybe less. That evening, she sat by the fire and wrote a letter. Not to Oren, who was gone. Not to Cedric, who was finished. She wrote to her sister, far to the west, careful words revealing nothing specific, only that she was alive. That Cale was alive. That they might be coming soon, if circumstances allowed. She sealed the letter and placed it in the hollow beneath the rock, where Bridget would find it and send it without asking questions she had learned from Oren not to ask. The reply came weeks later, 4 sentences that changed everything. "Come whenever you are ready. Stay as long as you need. There is a room with a bed, and there is work for a good seamstress, and there is a place for both of you here." Ilara read the letter by firelight and felt something loosen in her chest. A tension she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. The weight of having nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no exit from the life she had built. She had an exit now. She just had to use it. She looked at the walls she had raised, the chimney that breathed without being seen, the shelves stocked with food, the water channel running clean and steady, the stone bench where Cale sat every morning reading his books, the corner where Bramble slept every night, pressing his graying body against the boy he had guarded since the beginning. She had built all of this. Every stone and shelf and channel and beam. She had turned a ledge of rock into a home that kept them alive through winters that should have killed them. She had raised a son who could read and write and name every plant in the ravine, and stack stones with hands that were already learning the language his grandfather had spoken. She would not give up the ravine. The ravine was giving her up. The secret had grown too large for the space that held it. Too many people knew. Too many threads could be pulled. And she would not wait for the thread that unraveled everything. she would leave on her own terms. She would walk out of this ravine the same way she had walked in, on her own 2 feet, with her son beside her and her dog ahead of her, and her head held high. Not because she had been discovered, not because she had been defeated, but because she had built something strong enough to leave behind. And she had raised a boy who deserved more than hiding. $225. 5 years of sewing work sold through a dead man's store. Enough to travel. Enough to start over. Enough to become someone else entirely, in a place where no one knew her name or her story. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her dress, next to the place where she had once carried $51 in a coat lining, and she began to plan her final departure the way she had planned everything else in this ravine. 1 step at a time, 1 stone at a time, 1 decision placed carefully upon the last. She told Cale on a morning when the light came through the gap in the wall at the angle she liked best, the angle that made the limestone glow warm and turned the dust in the air into something that looked like gold. "We are leaving," she said. Cale was sitting on the stone bench with his book open on his lap. He looked up at his mother and did not speak for a long time. He was 9 years old now. He had spent more than half his life in this ravine. He had learned to read by firelight and lantern light. He had learned to write on slate and then on paper. He had learned to fish and trap and forage and stack stones and name every plant that grew within 100 yards of the overhang. He knew the sound the creek made when rain was coming, and the sound it made when the weather would hold. He knew which birds arrived first in spring and which ones left last in autumn. He knew this place the way most children know their bedrooms, their schoolyards, their neighborhoods. This was all of those things combined into one. "This is our home," he said. "This is where we have lived," Ilara said. "But it is not where we will always live." "Why not?" She sat beside him on the bench. She had been thinking about this conversation for months, rehearsing the words, trying to find the version that would make sense to a boy who had never walked down a street or sat in a classroom or spoken to another child his own age. "Because you deserve more than this, Cale. You deserve schools and friends and a life in the daylight. You deserve to walk down a road without hiding. You deserve to tell people your name without being afraid. I like the ravine. I know you do. I do too. But there are people who might find us here, people who might still try to take you away from me. I will not let that happen. I will never let that happen." Cale was quiet for a moment. He looked around the space that had been his entire world. The stone walls, the clay shelves holding their few possessions, the gap where light came through, the firebox that warmed them through the cold months, the corner where Bramble slept every night. "If we go somewhere else," he said slowly, "we would not have to hide anymore?" "No, we would not have to hide." "We could walk in the daylight?" "Yes." "I could go to school?" "You could go to school, a real school with other children." "We could have friends?" "We could have friends." Cale considered this. She could see him weighing it, the known against the unknown, the safety of the familiar against the promise of something larger. He was 9 years old and already capable of thinking in ways that most children his age had never been required to think. 5 years in hiding had given him that. 5 years of watching his mother solve problems that should have been unsolvable had taught him that change was not the same as loss, that leaving was not the same as giving up. "Can Bramble come?" he asked. "Of course Bramble can come. He is family. He will always be family." The dog, hearing his name, lifted his gray muzzled head from his paws. He was 7 years old now. His copper coat had faded, shot through with silver along his ribs and haunches. His movements were slower on cold mornings. His eyes, which had once tracked every shadow and every sound with the intensity of a young hunter, now spent most of their time resting on Cale with the steady patience of an animal who has found his purpose and sees no reason to look for another one. But he still positioned himself between the boy and any unfamiliar sound. He still growled softly at things that moved in ways they should not. He was old, but he was not finished. "Then I will go," Cale said. "If Bramble goes, I will go." They left on a morning in early spring when the weather was clear and cold and the creek ran low and the trees were just beginning to show the green haze that preceded leaves, the forest waking slowly from its long sleep. Ilara had prepared for weeks. She had packed their few possessions into bundles that could be carried on the horse. She had written a final note to Bridget, thanking her for the help, explaining that they were leaving the area, asking her to burn any records that might reveal where they had been. She had said goodbye to the ravine in her own way. She walked the length of it one more time in the pre-dawn darkness, touching the stone wall she had built with her own hands, running her fingers along the fitted joints where limestone met limestone, each stone chosen and placed and tested by her hands alone. She stood beneath the overhang that had sheltered them for 5 years and remembered the first day she had seen it, standing in the rain, thinking, "This is already a room." It had been a room. It had been a home. It had been a fortress and a hiding place and a sanctuary and a prison all at once. It had kept them alive when the world outside was trying to take everything she had. It had held them through fevers and fears and the slow, patient accumulation of seasons that marked the passage of years no calendar would ever record. Now it would be a memory. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall one last time and felt the cold of it and the solidity of it and the permanence of it. This wall would stand long after she was gone. These stones would hold their places long after the hands that placed them had turned to dust. That was the nature of stone. It endured. It did not forget. They walked out of the ravine as the sun rose. Ilara led the horse, packed with their supplies. 4 of the 7 sheep followed, the survivors of the original flock, old now, but still capable of the journey. Cale walked beside his mother, holding her hand. Bramble walked ahead of them all, stopping every few yards to look back and make sure they were following, the way he had always done, the way he would always do. At the top of the ravine, where the ground leveled out and the trees began, Ilara paused. She could see the Ashford property from here, the fields she had worked, the house she had lived in, the fence line she had crossed 5 years ago with a 4-year-old child and a desperate plan. 70 feet. She had lived 70 feet from that fence line for 5 years. She had raised her son within earshot of the people who had tried to take him. She had built a life so close to the people who wanted to destroy her that a shout might have carried between them on a still night. And they had never known. She allowed herself a moment of something that might have been pride or satisfaction, or simply the bone-deep relief of having survived something that should have destroyed her. Then she turned away from the farm and faced the road that led west. "Come on," she said to Cale. "We have a long way to go." "Is it far?" "Very far, but we will get there." "Will it be as good as the ravine?" Ilara looked at her son, 9 years old, dark hair falling across his forehead, serious eyes that had seen more than most children his age would ever see. "It will be different," she said. "Different is not the same as worse. Sometimes different is exactly what we need." Cale thought about this with the gravity of a child who has learned to think before speaking. "Okay," he said. "Let us go see different." They traveled for weeks. Side roads and forest paths and trails that avoided the main routes. They slept in barns when farmers offered space. They slept under trees when no shelter was available. They ate what they carried and what they could find, and what kind strangers offered them along the way. Bramble grew tired quickly. His old legs were not made for long walks anymore. But he refused to be carried. He refused to ride the horse. He refused to do anything except put one paw in front of another until his family stopped for the night. Stubbornness in a dog looks exactly like stubbornness in the people who raise it, and Bramble had been raised by Ilara Whitmore. He died on the 15th day of travel. It happened in the evening, after they had stopped to make camp beside a small stream. Cale was gathering firewood. Ilara was unpacking their supplies. Bramble walked to a patch of soft grass in the last of the afternoon sunlight. He circled once, the way dogs do. He lay down. He did not get up. Ilara knew immediately. She had seen death before. She knew the particular stillness that came when the spirit departed and only the body remained. She knelt beside the dog who had followed her into the ravine, who had kept watch over her son through fevers and fears, through 5 years of hidden life. She put her hand on his side. The copper-colored fur was still warm from the sun. The heartbeat beneath was gone. Cale found her there when he returned with his armload of wood, kneeling beside his oldest friend. "Mama?" Ilara looked up at her son, looked at his face, already crumpling with understanding. "He was tired," she said gently. "He held on as long as he could. He wanted to make sure we got away safely. He wanted to see us started on our new life." Cale dropped the firewood. He fell to his knees beside the dog who had slept at the foot of his bed for as long as he could remember. He put his arms around Bramble's neck the way he had done every night for 9 years, and he held on. They buried him in a meadow beside the stream. Cale found flat stones to mark the grave. Ilara dug the hole with the adze that had built their home in the ravine. They lowered the dog into the earth and covered him and stood beside the small mound while Cale said the words he needed to say. "You were a good boy. You were the best boy. You kept us safe. You kept me warm. I will miss you every single day." They stayed beside the grave until the stars came out. Then they made a small fire and ate a small meal and slept a small sleep, pressed close together in the space where Bramble used to lie. In the morning, they continued walking. Their new home was different. That was the first thing Cale noticed when they arrived, exhausted and travel-worn, at his aunt's small house. The mountains in the distance, the air that was thinner and sharper, the way people moved through the streets faster, as if the altitude itself made everyone hurry. Alara's sister had prepared a room, a bed with a real mattress, a window with glass, a door that locked from the inside. Luxuries that felt strange after 5 years of living in a space carved from limestone and clay. Cale went to school for the first time in his life. He was behind the other children in some ways. He had never sat in a classroom. He had never raised his hand. He had never walked in a line or played in a schoolyard or eaten lunch surrounded by children his own age. But he could read better than most of them. He could write in a clear, careful hand that his teachers praised. He could do mathematics in his head. He could name plants and animals and weather patterns with a precision that startled everyone who tested him. He caught up quickly. By the end of the first year, he was near the top of his class. By the end of the second, he had friends and interests and a life that looked nothing like the hidden existence he had left behind. Alara opened a seamstress shop on a quiet side street. The same work she had done in hiding, now done in full daylight. Hems and repairs and custom dresses for women who could afford them. Nothing fancy, nothing that required her to be noticed or remembered. Just steady work for steady pay. The kind of labor that let her rent a small place and send Cale to school and build a life that was hers alone. She did not remarry. Men asked over the years. Some of them were kind. Some of them were respectable. But Alara had learned something in the ravine about what she truly needed and what she could live without. She needed her son. She needed her work. She needed a door she could close, and a space she could control, and a life that depended on no one's permission but her own. She did not need a man to complete any of it. The years accumulated the way stones accumulate in a wall, one at a time, each one finding its place against the ones that came before. Cale grew into a man who built things. The knowledge his mother had given him, the understanding of how pieces fit together to make something larger than themselves, found its way into everything he did. He married a woman who taught school. He became a father. He named his daughter with a fresh name that carried no weight from the past, a name for a new beginning. Alara held her granddaughter for the first time on a spring morning and felt time fold back on itself. She remembered holding Cale when he was this small. She remembered the weight of him in her arms beneath a limestone overhang, the smell of wood smoke and creek water, the sound of a dog breathing at her feet. She remembered thinking she would do anything to protect him. She had done anything. She had done everything. And here was the proof. A granddaughter she would never have known if she had surrendered. A family that existed only because she had refused to let it be taken from her. Alara grew older. Her hair went white. Her hands, which had stacked stones and carved clay and sewn thousands of seams, began to ache in the mornings. She did not complain. She had never been one for complaining. She simply adapted, the way she had always adapted. One evening, late, when the house was quiet and the fire was low, she gave Cale a leather journal. It was worn soft with handling, filled with her careful handwriting. "What is this?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Every temperature recorded, every measurement taken, every technique tested. The chimney channel, the thermal properties of clay walls, the water system, all of it." Cale opened the journal. Page after page of observations and diagrams and calculations. Not a diary, not a memoir, a scientific document. A record of experimentation and observation, of problems identified and solutions tested, of knowledge accumulated through trial and error, and the stubborn refusal to accept that survival was impossible. "Why?" he asked. "Why does this matter?" "Because someone should know," she said. "Because what was learned in that ravine was real. Because knowledge should not disappear with the person who discovered it." She reached for his hand. Her grip was lighter than it used to be. The strength that had moved stones and carved earth and built a home from nothing was fading, the way all strength fades eventually. "I was not just running," she said. "I was building. Building is always better than running. Remember that." Cale kept the journal for the rest of his life. He showed it to colleagues sometimes. He showed them the diagrams and the calculations, and watched their eyebrows rise as they recognized what they were seeing. Passive thermal design, heat retention through clay mass, smoke dispersal through horizontal channeling, principles that were only beginning to be studied formally, figured out by a woman alone in a ravine with a carpenter's adze and $51. "Your mother figured this out," they would say, "with no training." "She had training," Cale would answer. "Her father taught her, and his father taught him. The training was older than any of us." He never went back to the ravine. He carried it with him in a different way, in the journal, in his memory, in the way he approached every challenge. When something seemed impossible, he thought of his mother stacking stones in the cold. When something seemed hopeless, he thought of her digging a 14-foot channel through clay with nothing but an adze and determination. When something seemed beyond his abilities, he thought of her standing in the rain beneath a limestone overhang, thinking, "This is already a room." She had taught him that anything could become something else, that problems were just rooms that had not been finished yet. The ravine stands today much as it stood when Ilara found it. The creek still runs through the limestone cut. The overhang still extends from the east wall, and the stone wall, dry stacked and solid, still closes the opening that a woman chose to make her home. The stones remember. They remember the weight of her hands placing them. They remember the heat of fires that burned for 5 winters without being seen. They remember the footsteps of a child growing up in hiding, and a dog keeping watch, and a mother refusing to let the world take what belonged to her. Stones hold memory differently than people do. Stones do not forget. Stones do not embellish. Stones simply remain exactly where they were placed, telling their truth to anyone patient enough to listen. A woman walked out of a parlor, knowing she had 5 days to save her son. She did not save him by running far away. She saved him by building close by. She saved him by staying exactly where no one would think to look. She saved him by creating a home where there had been only rock and water and empty air. And she saved him by never, not once in 5 years of hiding, giving up. That is what the ravine remembers. That is what the stones still hold. A mother's love transformed into architecture. A woman's determination transformed into walls. A life built one stone at a time in a place where no one thought to look, by hands that refused to stop working. And it is still standing.